I think, yeah, if it's all right, I will start. Welcome to those of you who are here. We're going to give it a few more minutes to let people join in. So yes, as I said, this is our first webinar of a series of a couple of sessions that we're going to do for the rest of this year. We're very excited, a little bit nervous, but yes, more excited. To give a quick introduction, my name is Cath. I am the campaign coordinator for the Bloodlines campaign, and I head up the Youth for Lions campaign. With me is Louise. Lou?
Yes, I have joined the Bloodlines team early in the year, in January. I'm the campaign manager for the campaign. Very exciting, and it's been a very exciting, extremely busy year. We all thought going into lockdown, oh my words, what is going to happen? Well, I can tell you, we've all been flat out during the whole lockdown period. So yeah, that at least it kept us from becoming bored, but it's been a very exciting journey so far to be part of the Bloodlines team. We're such a small but very passionate team. So, and these webinars is something new for us that we're doing. We've tried to make the various topics of interest and varied, and so please give us some feedback on that as well if you feel that you would like to hear something about a particular topic within, you know, obviously within the space that we're working in, but we are releasing all the webinar topics per month. So yeah, it's going to be quite an interesting journey. So we would love to get some of your feedback at the end of the session. That would really help.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Louise. So one more person that I'd just like to introduce to all the attendees who have joined us is Janelle. She is our digital marketing manager. She's going to be moderating your questions. So when it comes time to questions, once we have a few more attendees, I'll explain a little bit more. But if you can please use the Q&A box, and Janelle will moderate those questions for us to answer live. We will also be recording the questions and getting to them afterwards. We don't want to leave any questions out. Everything is important, so we will be keeping those on record and answering them afterwards and sending perhaps a document to everybody afterwards. So yeah, Janelle is also here. So when you hear a third voice, that's her. All right, should we have 53 attendees with us? Should we get started?
I think so, yes. It's 35. I think we should start.
Perfect. All right, so yes, thank you everybody. Welcome to our first webinar session, The Con in Conservation, debunking the myth that the intensive captive breeding of lions and other big cats for commercial purposes is a conservation tool. Just a brief overview of how this session is going to work. We'll give a little bit of background on lions in the wild, the captive breeding industry, and then we are going to go through 3 main myths that exist in this industry. After each myth, we are going to call for 2 questions from the Q&A box. So Janelle will moderate those questions and she will let us know which ones to answer. We will keep it to 2 just because of time. But then at the end of the webinar, after we've done the 3rd myth, we will do a full Q&A session for the time that we have left. As I said, any questions that we miss, we will be able to answer afterwards. Yeah. So jumping straight into it, I think first and foremost, we need to chat about lions in the wild. Lou?
Yes, absolutely. I think before we go to the captive population, I think we should be looking at lions in the wilds. And as many of you probably do know, that lions are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN red list of threatened species. So this indicates their conservation status across Africa. And the red list is very often used as a tool to protect our natural resources, but also quite often for policy change. So there's quite a few different categories, from going from least concern right up through to extinct in the wild and completely extinct. So vulnerable is kind of somewhere in the middle, but we are starting to get quite concerned about it, especially since we know that there has been a huge decline in their population, overall population, and also in their historic range. So across Africa, we know that lion numbers are estimated to have been declined by 43% in the last 20 years. And if we sort of look at 20 years, it's actually only 3 lion generations.
Yeah,
So 43% decline in just 3 lion generations. So at the moment, it's estimated that there's about 20,000 lions left in Africa, across Africa, in only 8% of their historic range. So their habitats, their available habitat, has just been decimated and reduced so much. And in some pockets, like for example West Africa, we know that they're actually now critically endangered. So their population size is just so small. I think if we sort of look at the lion population in the wild and managed, the managed wild population is the population that we find in our smaller, very often private reserves. So they are wild, but they are sort of wild managed. That is how they're being classified. In South Africa, our population is about 3,000. So that's not bad, it's pretty stable. But then if we jump to the captive population and then compare what we have in terms of those lions in a captive population, it's a very different story. The official figure is 8,000 lions in captivity, but it's estimated that it's closer to 10 to 12,000 lions in captivity. So basically it means that we've got 3 to 4 times more lions in captivity here in South Africa than we still have in the wilds. And that is just, to me, that's always the most shocking fact when we talk about the captive breeding industry.
Yeah, it puts it into perspective, I think, when you think about, 3,000 versus 8,000 or even 10,000. So, one of the main parts of this is that South Africa's wild population of lions is actually stable. It does sound quite scary when we start talking about a 43% decline, but at the moment, the population is stable, which means that it's not shrinking. It's actually increasing slightly at the moment. Despite this, there are a few threats that wild lion populations are facing. Human-wildlife conflict is one of the main threats to wild populations. It's one of the main reasons why their populations have declined across Africa throughout the years, because human populations have grown and have increased so dramatically in the last few decades, and our living space is encroaching on lion living space, on the wild habitats. So
exactly,
this conflict between the lions and the grazing animals and the humans, that's one of our biggest threats that's facing lions at the moment. Another reason for some of the declines is overgrazing by domestic animals and ineffective management of these lions in managed areas, unfortunately. Disease such as bovine TB and trophy hunting are both quite large contributing factors to declining numbers of wild lions. Another one is the lion bone trade, which we will chat a little bit more about later on and in other webinar sessions. But the lion bone trade is currently a legal and accepted practice in South Africa. The South African government currently allows an annual export quota of lion bones it has been approximately 800 lion skeletons per year. And lion ecologists are of the opinion that the lion bone trade is one of the main reasons for a rapid increase in poaching incidences of wild and managed lions.
Yes, and I think it might also be interesting to just say here that even though we have, it's legal, the lion bone trade, and we have had an export of around 800 per year. At the moment, there's some hiccups, and yeah, the department hasn't actually set a bone quota last year, and they haven't set one this year so far. So that brings us kind of to the lion breeding industry. So let's look at that a little bit further, because as the captive lion breeding industry exists today in South Africa, it actually originated already in the 1990s. But then in sort of 2009, we had about 3,000, just over 3,000 lions in captivity, and then it started booming. And yeah, it boomed to basically now 10 to 12,000 lions in about 400 facilities. Many of those facilities, they actually exist in the Free State, the Northwest, and Limpopo provinces. Those are the three main provinces where the captive breeding of lions actually exists and happens. I think something that we very often forget is that we don't just breed lions. We breed and keep huge numbers of other big cats as well. Cheetahs, leopards, caracals, servals, and then we also do the exotics, the tigers, the jaguars, the pumas, and even crossbreeds like ligers, which is a crossbreed between a tiger and a lion. So there's lots of other big cats in captivity as well. But the department, the government has never really done a proper audit, national audit of all the legal, let alone the illegal captive breeding and keeping facilities in South Africa. So there are no realistic numbers in terms of numbers of facilities or numbers of predators in total that exists around the country. And I think also one of the problems is with this industry that those numbers, they change all the time. So animals are being moved, they're being sold, they're being killed. So on a virtually daily basis, those numbers change. They change overall. If you look at the whole captive population, but also they very much change within one facility.
I think, Lou, just what was our most recent official numbers released by the government? Because they did release quite recently a mini audit that they did. What were those?
Yes, they did a sort of what they called an audit, and the Barbara Creasy, our current Minister of Environment, last year she announced or answered in Parliament to question that there's 7,979 lions, so more or less 8,000 in 366 facilities. So those are the official numbers.
Yeah, and yeah, so that was fairly recent, but we and other researchers estimate it to be much more.
Yes, absolutely. I think if we look then at some of our national biodiversity legislation, like our biodiversity, the National Environmental Management and Biodiversity Act, the NEMBA Act. Under that act, we have biodiversity management plans for certain key species, and one of those species is lion. So in 2015, this a biodiversity management plan for the African lion was created, and it actually, interestingly, it acknowledges in there that captive lions are used exclusively to generate money and currently have limited conservation value.
And that's from our government. That's stamped environmental affairs.
That is a government document that is part of our NEMBA Act. So, and if we look at all the commercial enterprises that are part of this breeding industry, we can see that the lions along every step of their captive lives, they're commoditized.
Yeah.
So there's this massive long commercial value chain from the moment that they are born and they're used in the tourism industry for cup petting, for walking with lions, where they're being raised by paying volunteers, to the point where they're more mature and live exports are happen, because again, that's something that very often we overlook. But over the last 10 years, we exported nearly 200 live lions each year. And the top importing countries are China, Thailand, and Vietnam. So those are the
year.
per year,
That's
on top of what we export in terms of trophies, which is another 885 per year, with the States being the biggest importing country. And then obviously the lion bones that has also been going on since about 2007, 2008. And again, the early days we exported around 660 per year, but now that has been set to a quota of 800. So if you start adding that all up, we're exporting nearly 2,000 lions, dead or alive, every single year.
Yeah. And I mean, with the official number being 8,000 odd, is that excluding the ones that we have exported or that are ready to be exported? It's something that we need to kind of look into.
Yes, it's definitely something that needs more interrogation.
Yeah, for sure. So I think this is going to take us quite nicely into our first myth about these commercial enterprises that are involved. So, one of the main myths that exists in this industry is that lion cubs used for cub petting have been orphaned. I don't know about you, Louise. Folks, attendees who are listening, if you'd like to type in the chat box, we'd love to hear from you if you have heard or if you have been told this myth. Personally, I know I was when I was younger, and I was visiting a cub petting place before I knew about any of this. I was told that these little cubs were orphaned and it was terrible, and this whole heart-wrenching story that I believed. And I thought I was doing a great job by helping conservation.
No, absolutely. I was with some colleagues from the UK. We were visiting a few facilities earlier this year, and the exact same question. When you actually ask them, so where do these cubs come from? Where are their mothers? You get the story of, the mother abandoned them, or they were orphaned. And, when I hear those stories, I think, wow, these lions must be such bad mothers if we have that kind of number of cubs continuously.
For sure. No, definitely. So it's actually, it's sad, and it amazes me that so many unsuspecting tourists and volunteers are duped by this message, by these misleading messages that the cubs that they interact with or bottle feed in the case of volunteers have been rescued because they were orphaned or abandoned by their mothers, when in actual fact these cubs are born into captivity and they are removed from their mothers within the first few days, before they're weaned properly off their mother's milk. And the two reasons that they remove these cubs so early is, first of all, so that it forces the lioness straight back into estrus so that she can breed again and again, quicker and quicker. We do know that captive lionesses will breed up to 5 times more in their lifetime than they would in the wild. The second reason they take the cubs away is because it allows the cubs to be hand-reared and bottle-fed, which essentially makes them more tame, less wild, more used to humans, so that they can then be fed through this commercial enterprise of tourist activities involving one-on-one interactions with these animals. Unfortunately, and I'm sure, you know, it just kind of makes sense that there are health implications for both the mothers and the cubs when you remove an animal from its mother when it's so young, before it's weaned off the milk.
And let's not forget in that whole story as well, Cath, that that bottle feeding is then very often done by paying international volunteers. So that's another income stream again for them, because these volunteers pay handsomely for that's privilege. Yes. Yes, the health implications for both the cubs and the mothers are quite significant. So yeah, we have we interviewed Dr. Peter Caldwell recently. He is a specialist African carnivore veterinarian, and that's one of the things that we asked him about. And this is a sound clip from the interview on health implications on the mothers of this whole process where cubs are being removed early on and the mothers become like breeding machines.
Yeah. All right. So
they try and breed them as regularly as possible. Whenever they conceive, you know, they take those cubs away on day 1 or day 2 so they can hand raise them. So yes, they will come on to eat more frequently. And yes, it will be a lot more frequent than what it would happen in the wild. Taking cubs away from a mother early, at an early stage, brings on a whole new scenario for the mother and for the cubs. If you look at it from the mother's point of view, she goes through an amazing amount of trauma and psychological stress. Now with that stress, the cortisol levels go up, adrenaline levels go up, and with high chronic blood cortisol levels, it suppresses the immunity to an extent where they're highly susceptible to infections. And those females, they get to like 5 years old, they get what we call pyometra, bacterial infections in their uterus, they get cystic ovaries, they get a whole lot of breeding uterine and ovarian issues, which obviously compromises them, and they don't care, they just euthanize them. They don't put them on antibiotics, they don't spay them or do an ovarian hysterectomy on them. They just get rid of them because it costs them money to treat them. They get secondary infections, and many times they just let them die. They don't even euthanize them. No, sorry, it costs too much money. Put her to sleep. We've got 50 other lionesses.
Yeah, I think, you know, what he's saying, it's so clear that these animals purely are used and kept as a commodity. Yeah. We need to keep the bottom line as healthy as possible. So let's not spend too much on treatment that costs money.
Yeah.
I think on top of that, so that Dr. Peter Caldwell was talking there about the health implications on the mothers, but there's certainly a lot of health implications for the cubs as well. So it goes both ways. So we're removing, as Cath was saying, we're removing these cubs way too early from the mothers. So first of all, the psychological impact on the cub, but also the mother, because the mother, her litters are being taken away over and over and over again. So that has a massive implication in terms of her psychological mental state. Most people don't think about animals that way, but they do feel that kind of pain as well. But also from a cub's point of view, very often the cubs are taken away before they've even tasted the mother's milk. Then they're being fed on either cow's milk or a formula like Espilac. Espilac is actually a formula that's developed for dogs. So, and cow's milk, again, doesn't give them the right nutritional value. So whether it's a formula or cow's milk without the right kind of supplements in there, they just don't get the right nutritional content, and they start suffering from nutritional deficiencies that compromises their immune system, and that makes them more susceptible to diseases and also bone deformities. In one of the facilities I was earlier this year, there was this tiny little cub in the petting enclosure, and his little front legs were already bent like that.
Yeah, so he doesn't
And
have
that,
the nutrients from mother's milk that builds bones, that builds immune systems, that builds everything.
the vitamins, the right supplements.
Yeah.
I actually asked Dr. Peter Caldwell when we saw him, I showed him the picture and he said, yeah, that's nutritional deficiencies. Yeah, on top of that, they're very often kept in substandard enclosures. They're not always hygienic, so there's all sorts of bacteria that, you know, leads to disease. We have absolutely no idea in terms of cub mortality in these breeding farms. There's no official stats. But anecdotal information does indicate that in some places, I'm not saying everywhere, but in some places it can be as high as 40 to 60% of the cubs dying.
That are dying.
And that is often by the time before they even reach 3 months. And on top of all of that as well, they're working these animals, because I call it working.
It is working, yeah.
Yeah,
100%.
they're being petted 8 to 10 hours per day, 7 days a week. These animals should be sleeping, playing. You know, they don't have that kind of natural behavior. So, yeah, that is an added issue too.
Yeah, and I think it's an issue that we often forget about in this whole industry. I think is that these cubs are working. They're working animals basically, where they never get left alone. They never get the normal day that they would have in the wild, where they wake up, they sleep, they play, they sleep, they eat, they sleep. They're not getting that activity.
No, not at all.
So I think now is a good time to filter through perhaps one question. I'm not sure if we're good for time. So I think maybe Janelle, if one question from the Q&A can come through, we'll see if we can answer that based on what we've spoken about through myth 1.
Sure. So I am going to take the first question, which came through, and it's: do we know whether the lockdown has impacted the breeding of the captive big cats? I wonder whether there has been mass killings to reduce costs and use in the bone trade. This has come from Steph at Panthera Africa.
Okay. Lou, I think you're probably the best person to answer this.
Yeah, thank you, Steph. I think that's a really good question. And I think the lockdown has impacted on the industry because obviously they have no income like the rest of tourism. So they don't have the income from the volunteers, they don't have the income from the petting, there's no trophy hunting, and there is no bone quota set at the moment. So their income is dramatically chopped. We have seen cases, and the NSPCA are actually working on a couple of cases where this has led to malnutrition and basically not feeding the animals because there is no money. So further neglect of these animals. And in terms of mass killings, we haven't heard of any, but it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me if that was the case, and they're just stockpiling the bones, the skins, the teeth, for when they can start exporting. So yeah, we haven't received any sort of information with regards to that, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question.
I think that's great. I think that's all we have time for. Everyone who has asked questions, I'm very sorry. We will keep a record of them, and we'll do our best to answer them and send them through to everybody in a post-webinar communication. So I think we're going to move swiftly forward to the second myth, which is that captive breeding and artificial insemination helps conservation. It's one of the biggest questions that we are asked is, you know, is it a conservation tool? Because it's normally what the facilities will tell you. Like I said, it's what the one that I visited told me, is that their cubs are orphaned, they need to be rehabilitated so that they can help conservation. The reality is that, you know, these lions and other predators are bred intensively in captivity. The cubs and the sub-adults are used for tourist attractions such as cub petting and lion walking, where they are attracting paying visitors, paying volunteers. They are also being bred for live exports, as Louise mentioned earlier. They're being exported to zoos and breeding facilities or tourist petting parks across the world. I think Louise said something, 200 odd live lions being exported for zoos and facilities like this per year. If they're not being used for these kinds of exports, odds are that the majority of them are being sold to canned hunting facilities, where they are shot in captive canned hunting situations for their trophies, or they are simply killed for their bones to be exported to Southeast Asia in the lion bone trade to supplement the tiger bone trade. So one of the main questions that we have is, can these captive lions contribute to conservation in the end? And I think it's really interesting to hear from lion ecologists on this question, because they're at the forefront of this argument. And Guy Baum is with Panthera. He's a lion ecologist with Panthera. He was interviewed for the Blood Lions film, and this is a little soundbite of what he has to say about captive breeding and conservation.
I can't see any way in which these captive breeding facilities in South Africa can contribute to lion conservation. At the moment, they are commercial enterprises. That's all they are, and they certainly shouldn't be selling themselves as conservation organizations. It's very important that you know the lion's genetic heritage, I guess you could call it. Whenever reintroducing a species or translocating a species, you ideally would like to move individuals from as near to the population where those animals will be going as possible. Maintaining genetic integrity is very important when it comes to maintaining the overall fitness of populations. The more genetically diverse a species, the more likely it is to persist in the long term. So I think that the captive breeding industry, it distracts from, it diverts attention from what I think are the more important conservation actions that are required to ensure lions' long-term persistence. And many of these organizations and facilities sell themselves as conservation bodies. And it's donors, they love to be able to the sort of the tangible approach that you get with a captive bred facility. You can see lions at times, you can touch them, you can walk with them, and then that's a much easier product to sell than when it comes to securing intact habitat. So it really can, it really does basically divert attention away from the more important conservation issues. And it really is an issue when they start saying that they're conservation organizations and they're contributing to the conservation of the species as a whole, because they're not. They're businesses, they're commercial enterprises, and the lions that are being bred within those, they have no contribution whatsoever to wild lion conservation. They're essentially livestock.
So yeah, that's from a lion ecologist himself.
Yeah, and I think, that is, as we were saying earlier, when we look at the historic range, lions appear only in 8% of their historic range. So one of the most important parts of lion conservation is actually securing safe habitats. That is much more important than captive breeding, because they actually very successfully breed in the wild, and we'll hear from Peter Caldwell in a minute on that as well. So that leaves us really, well, they actually breed so successfully in the wild that many of the smaller reserves, they struggle because they have an overpopulation of lions now, because they can't actually sustain the smaller size of the reserve can't sustain the larger pride. So they have a problem. They already sort of sell and exchange lions with other smaller reserves. And then, yes, the artificial insemination, there are facilities that are experimenting with the artificial insemination of lions. And in my opinion, it's a mute exercise, because lions reproduce successfully in the wild. They don't need that help from a captive breeding point of view. But let's see what Peter Caldwell has got to say on this topic.
So we're managing their breeding out in the wild. So why is it necessary to breed these animals in captivity? It's not. As far as breeding lions, artificially inseminating lions, and also breeding lions in captivity to put them out in the wild is absolute rubbish. There's no reason to artificially inseminate a lion in captivity. Lions breed so well out in the wild, whether they're in the metapopulation Big Five game reserves or out in the wild or in the bush on farmlands. They breed so well. Why would you want to artificially inseminate them? Why would you want to breed them in captivity? There's no reason. And from a veterinary point of view and a veterinary health point of view, it's not necessary. That is basically farming them like production animals, which is not necessary, and there's no requirement for it. Where do they want to put them? There's not enough space for these animals. I mean, we are struggling to find homes for lions born out in the wild. And the only reason why they breed them in captivity is for the lion bone trade and for their skins and for being exported on the black market for personal gain. They don't put that money back into conservation and in lion caring.
Okay, so I suppose, that answers your question. From a veterinary perspective, there is no conservation value in captive breeding and artificial insemination of lions.
No.
So I think very quickly, if we can take one short question before we move on, we're going to run out of time shortly. So what do you think, Lou? Should we just carry on and kind of keep questions till the end?
Janelle, is there a burning question at the end here that we can do? Otherwise, we just carry on.
Most are general, so they can get answered at the end.
Perfect.
Let's do that then.
Let's move on. All right, so our third and final myth of the day is, I think I've said this about almost all the myths, but this is by far our biggest question, is can these lions be released into the wild? Because it's the ultimate dream is for this to be a possibility, that these lions will have a purpose for conservation. And the long and the short, the sad fact is they cannot be rewilded or released into the wild for a variety of reasons. Firstly, they would never be able to hunt for themselves or protect themselves from dangers such as wild lion, prides, or buffalo, because they wouldn't have grown up learning about these kinds of dangers from their parents, from their pride members. Not to mention the fact that captive bred lions are physically weaker than wild lions because of the smaller environments in which they grow up. They're not walking large distances. They're not play fighting and play hunting with the larger animals. So they will be naturally weaker. The second reason is that these animals have no fear of humans. They are humanized, they're habituated to humans, and they do associate humans with food. So releasing these animals into a wild area where they are close to communities is a danger to humans, to domesticated animals and livestock, because they associate humans with food, and they will go towards those communities if they are hungry. Lastly, if it were possible, scientists agree that it's not a conservation option at the moment, and that South Africa's wild lion populations are stable. As I said earlier, they're not decreasing, they are actually increasing. And I think Peter Caldwell also confirmed that, is that we are battling to find homes for some of these lions that are being born into the smaller reserves.
Exactly.
So Dr. Guy Baum is one of these ecologists that agrees with the stance that it's not a conservation tool, and that wild lion populations are stable.
So conservation-wise, our greatest priority is to secure where lions live. So to secure the habitat, the prey population, so there's enough food to allow lion numbers to build up and remain stable. And only then, and once those conditions have basically been secured, would one start exploring whether it's necessary to actually start supplementing populations from other sources. And captive bred facilities certainly wouldn't be the first choice where you source those individuals to try and booster wild populations. We certainly have a ready source of lions from our smaller reserves. These are wild lions, so the smaller reserves throughout South Africa. These populations were basically reintroduced 10 to 20 years ago, and they've done extremely well. And they've done so well now where there's almost a surplus of individuals. And so they're now these excess lions, and there's nowhere for them to go. So if one was considering repopulating an area or supplementing an existing wild population, this would be the best source to draw from. Certainly not captive bred individuals, which are that much more difficult to reintroduce to the wild. These are animals which have lost their fear of humans, so obviously the likelihood of there being conflict later, once individuals have been released into the wild, is that much greater than using a wild individual. They've lost some of their ability to hunt, to basically survive in a natural setting and compete against other carnivores. So no, there really isn't a role for captive bred lions when it comes to repopulating or supplementing wild populations.
Okay, so
yeah, and I think on top of that is the inbreeding as well. Our captive breeders, they don't keep records or stud books. Very often they have no idea about a parental lineage. So inbreeding is pretty common in the wild population, in the captive population, especially when we're talking, for example, white lions. So what does that mean? So basically breeders allow a male to breed with his daughters, granddaughters, and even great-granddaughters. So you actually reduce the genetic diversity of a population. And those compromised genes can lead to all sorts of issues. Reduced fertility is one of them, slow growth rates, all sorts of disorders. They can be like this lion is cross-eyed, they can have stumpy legs, but there's also lots of internal deformities that don't show on the outside, but can create havoc for the animals on the inside. And very high death rate very often amongst cubs as well as a result of inbreeding. So basically, a population like that where you have compromised genes, you don't want that to go out in the wilds. You don't want that to be mixed with the much stronger wild genes of the wild population. So that is also a really strong point on why the captive bred population is just not suitable for reintroduction, and it's definitely one of the reasons that scientists and ecologists completely agree with, in terms of the inbreeding that is really so prevalent. And I think maybe very, very quickly, crossbreeding as well. Now, obviously, those animals could never be reintroduced because we're actually crossbreeding between a species that doesn't even exist on our continent, a tiger. So, how could we ever reintroduce those kind of animals? And we breed a lot for rarities. For the count of the captive hunting. So yeah, there's a lot of unnatural situations being created within the captive population, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, the long and the short of it is that these captive bred lions can't be released into the wild. They're not strong enough, and their genes are not strong enough.
No. So I hope that's sort of debunked those myths for everybody.
I think we're going to skip right through to kind of general questions.
Yes.
If that's all right. If anyone, Janelle, if anyone has a question, you can let me know who they are. They're welcome to raise their hand, and I can, or would you like to read them out to keep it a bit shorter?
Yeah, I think, sorry, we've been sort of time-wise not been doing so well to start with, so it might be better to read them out, and any questions that haven't been answered, we will come back to you all to answer those. So don't worry, we will get back to you.
Yeah. So Janelle.
Okay, so we'll start with this question. What about lion breeding being transferred to agriculture with the recent amendments to the AIA and proposed amendments to the MSA?
Yeah, so the AIA is the Animal Improvement Act and the MSA is the Meat Safety Act, and there's been a lot in the media recently about those two acts that fall under agriculture. So they've been amended. Lions, for example, have been one of the 26 indigenous wild species that have now been included in the Animal Improvement Act. There's been amendments proposed for the Meat Safety Act. Lions have not yet, I say, been included in that. But I think it is a very worrying development that, and this is, we believe, is being pushed from the breeding industry. They would like to fall under agriculture because it is less bureaucratic for them. They don't need all these TOPS and NEMBA permits to do their business, to transport, to sell lions, all that sort of thing. So the industry would love to be moved towards agriculture. So one of the things that the Game Rangers Forum said in a statement a while back is that there's numerous advantages for game farmers to fall under agriculture, as they recognize, as an agricultural department, recognize game farming as a commodity producing activity and not an extension of the state conservation activities. So it just makes it much easier for them to conduct their business, although the Department of the Environment has insisted that these animals, like lions and cheetahs and rhinos, will still fall under NEMBA and the TOPS regulations, and therefore will still require those permits. But yeah, it's a very worrying development. I think we're all very worried that we can see how our natural heritage is slowly but surely being literally transferred and transformed into agricultural farm animals in a commodity.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And it's, yeah, very sad. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time left, but a lot of these questions are coming through that are asking what can people do to help, be it from an international side, people from overseas asking how they can help, beyond social media, how they can help. Yeah, so if we can maybe just give people an idea of how they can get involved if they want to make a difference.
Sure. So if anyone has not watched the film, I think watching the film is your first point of call. We do have a watch the film tab on our website that has throughout the world where you can kind of get the film. If you're in South Africa, it is on Netflix at the moment. Big clap. It's also on Showmax, so
yes,
you're able to stream it from there. That would be the first thing, is watch the film, get all the knowledge, educate yourself so that you are able to educate your friends and your family. The second thing that can be done is, if you are in the tourism industry, we do have a tourism campaign called the Born to Live Wild campaign. That is a pledge for tour operators that are against captive interactive activities. So if you are in the tourism industry and you have not signed our Born to Live Wild pledge, please pop over to the website. There is a tab there on our homepage. And you can email me, info@bloodlions.org, and we can get a pledge signed for you. The more support we get from the tourism industry, the better, definitely.
Because those sort of pledges, we do lobby with government as well. So we are putting pressure on, for example, Department of Tourism, to start acknowledging the fact that this whole industry is actually impacting negatively on our reputation as a conservation, but also on our tourism reputation. Yeah. So I think that that is very important. And in addition to that, do not take part. Do not be part of the problem. Yeah. And tell your friends, your family. Tell them why. Tell them not to take part in cup petting, not to go walking with big cats, to not volunteer at those kind of facilities, because that will take out one of those chains in that whole economic value chain. Yeah. If they don't get the income from that, it becomes more and more difficult to actually make that industry work. Yeah. So yes, we have to put pressure on all sides. So from tourism point of view, I think it's really important. That is where we have to start applying pressure more and more now, to try and get the tourism industry as a whole to stand behind and you know, we have these SATSA guidelines now. Yeah. SATSA has developed own guidelines, and that is very clear. They've drawn a line in the sand and they're very clear. Things like interaction with cubs, interaction, walking with big cats, all those kind of things are just not acceptable any longer.
Yeah, and it's all lobbying and support and people being as loud as they possibly can about it. So I think that's always our first thing when people ask, how can I help, is be as loud as you can so that we can lobby against government, so that government can see how many people are actually against this. So we do have a Get Involved page on our website. It's called Get Involved, and it's got a whole bunch of options there for you. Another way that you can help, I don't know if the link is on there yet, is to email the government. If you would like to email the government directly, please just pop us an email and we'll help as much as possible. Yes. Because the more that they hear from the public, I think the better. So yeah, I think we are unfortunately out of time. It's so hard. These things can go on for hours. It's great.
I know. I can't believe how quickly that hour went, actually.
It's lovely. It really is very nice. So yes, so visit the website, get involved, follow on social media, share on social media, because you know you can educate your friends and your contacts about this, and encourage them also not to get involved in the industry. And last but certainly not least, please join us for our next webinar, which will be on the 23rd of July. February, where did the rest of the year go? On the 23rd of July, we will be releasing information about that on our social media. So keep an eye on the social media. And if you would definitely like to ask more questions, please pop them into the Q&A, pop them into the chat box, and we will do our absolute best to